Welcome to the PR in Lockdown podcast, your guide to PR and communications in a post-lockdown world. Produced by Access Studios in collaboration with the PRCA. I'm Rob Double, and in this episode, I'm talking to Kate Stevens, President of Europe at AxiCom, a specialist technology communications agency. We're looking international in this episode. Taking on the role of Europe President during lockdown, Kate provides us a real insight into the challenge of managing different teams and offices across Europe, especially in different stages of the pandemic. Kate, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So let's just talk about AxiCom in general. Just give us a lowdown of what AxiCom's about for anyone who doesn't know.
AxiCom is a tech specialist PR and communications agency. We've been going for about 25 years. We had our 25th anniversary at the end of last year, which is lucky it wasn't during a pandemic because we had a big party to celebrate.
Congratulations nonetheless.
Thank you. And we do corporate communications, consumer communications, but really specializing in translating that technology story and making it mean something to an end audience. So we have operations throughout Europe, which I look after, and offices throughout the US as well.
You've got a really interesting story, I think, during lockdown, because you became the president of AxiCom Europe during lockdown. You suddenly had to step up to this responsibility. So I suppose it'd be good to start actually with actually talking about you and personally how the lockdown journey has been and how you've coped with it, I suppose, over the last few months.
Well, who doesn't want to take on a business during a global pandemic, right? I mean, talk about set you up for success. On the one hand, it is a bit of a get out of, well, this year wasn't so good because global pandemic, it's nothing to do with me. But I guess the flip side is, we do have operations throughout Europe. So I'm suddenly looking after offices in Spain, in Italy that have been hit really hard by the pandemic, that have worse lockdowns than we experience here in the UK, that have staff that are struggling with that remoteness of it. And suddenly to have the responsibility for looking after people you've not previously looked after in a remote environment does certainly pose its challenges. And
how did you deal with that in the first, in your first week or couple of weeks when you got this responsibility? How did you get around that? How did you try and tackle that as a responsibility and a new challenge?
So I think probably unlike anybody else in this position, we had the extraordinary bad fortune and sad loss of my predecessor, Henry Brake, who passed away at the start of February. So as a business, we were very much reeling from that. So I was already in a gear of dragging our offices through something that was quite a seismic happening for us as an agency. And nobody at that point had given me this responsibility. It was just a thing that you do when you get through something. So wheels were already in motion of that strange remote looking after, that remote sense of mothering that you do to people when they really need an emotional support as opposed to a business support. So I guess actually the big transition and change for me was less about the emotional support to people, but that business support, because of course, the pandemic, the lockdown certainly impacted clients, and our businesses across Europe were affected to different degrees. A lot of clients paused work in Spain. Germany was quite impacted. And that then means you have to start reverting to, okay, how do we handle this? How do we make sure that we can retain staff? How do we make sure that we can plan? And how on earth can you plan during a pandemic? So it was a slightly different shift in gear because we were already in that nurturing phase, which I think actually in many ways sheltered us a little from the impact of the pandemic rolling through Europe.
Yeah, I mean that's incredible. Year you've had in the sense of the turbulence, the company, and the things that everyone in the team has had to go through, particularly in AxiCom Europe. You personally, how did it impact you? Has the last few months been a time of real stress and real responsibility and all this stuff that comes with that? And how have you got through that? How have you stepped up to the responsibility and done it in a way that's kept you in a position and level to be able to lead everyone through this across Europe?
I mean, of course, there's probably a correct answer here. But I think it would be fair and true and honest to say that behind the scenes, it's not been plain sailing and not been an easy ride. I think it's a perfect storm. I'm a mother of two young children, and I suddenly found myself locked down with a 5-year-old and 8-year-old and a husband whose work is choosing to restructure at this time, so also faces job uncertainty. So a very stressful and tense environment to also be taking on extra responsibility during a global pandemic, whilst also still grieving for my friend and colleague. So, truth be told, it's been tough. And I think I would say that across AxiCom, everyone is very, very resilient. We encourage people to talk about how they feel about things so that people aren't hiding things. And I very much was quite vocal and honest about stress points and challenges to my colleagues and peers. But I think, in truth, it was when Black Lives Matter really hit the media headlines, and I found myself trying to navigate us as a company through something else that is challenging when all the decisions are being put on your shoulders. And that, I think, for me, was probably the breaking point where I just thought, I'm really tired now. I'm really tired of having to put on the face and keep marching through. And I think it's okay for me to just storm out of my tiny locked down office and take the children to the park and just yell at the trees for a second. And it really has been a perfect storm of 2020. And everyone's lived this in a very, very different way. And everyone's been impacted in a very, very different way. But I think it's been hard. And I'm sure that at some point I'll be given a medal for coping or something, or maybe just a cup of tea and a day off. That'll do.
Yeah. And in terms, you've mentioned about how AxiCom, you have loads of European offices, and everywhere in Europe has, to some extent, been affected differently and is still being affected differently. But let's just talk about that first initial lockdown period, those first few months. How did you try and manage so many different islands of reality in a way? How did you try and manage teams who are going through very different things and in different stages of the coronavirus outbreak?
Well, at AxiCom, we always sort of talk about this Axi family. We're sort of very, very family orientated, treat each other a little like family. And a lot of the country managers who look after those different offices, I've worked with them for many, many years. So we know each other very well, which I always think is a good starting point for dealing with something like this. And it's really about allowing people to talk about the challenges that they're facing from an emotional level, but also from a business level. And, you know, as I said, some of our offices in particular were hit very hard, and each of our country managers is a different person and they will react to things in a different way. Some very pragmatic and calm, and some quite anxious and really struggling. So I think it's really just about tailoring and being very human at a time like this. You can't, you know, we're a WPP agency, so we've got forecasts to make, deadlines to tick. We've got to adhere to certain margins, and that's simply the way it is from a business perspective. Because, of course, there's a phenomenal amount of operating companies that have to toe the line on that. But if we were to lead our business in that way, it's just going to crush people. How can you motivate? How can you possibly plan when every single day during those early days, something different was happening? Another client had a supply chain issue, so needed to pause work. You know, fortunately, we're in tech, so a lot of our business was thriving because it enables stuff like this virtual environment that we're working in right now. But not everybody. And it was such an unknown. And, you know, places like in Spain, where the economy is already fragile, were certainly very nervous. So I think it's not about beating people with a stick. It's not about saying, well, what are the cuts that you're going to make to meet this? It's about, okay, how can we overcome this? How can we come together as a group and stop looking at each separate P&L across the office? And how can we support each other? If Sweden's doing really well right now, how can Sweden help prop some of the rest of us up as a group to keep us going through this time? So it was really very much a rallying case. And, we set up a team across Europe for people to share photos, videos of themselves. We ran a little competition across AxiCom, Axi workout of the day, and you won some Amazon vouchers, obviously home delivery, important. But, just tiny little things like that. We have a great team in HR and marketing, George and Hannah in particular, who really rose to the occasion of trying to rally everybody across Europe. Weekly newsletters with tips, roundups of some of the best movies to stream, working from home tips, some amusing photos of people creating their own standing desks with ironing boards on books, and, just really trying to pull that community together to make sure that nobody felt left out. We had one guy who actually built his own desk during the first few weeks. He was like, oh, well, I'm just going to order some wood and build a desk. Sure, why not?
I've heard some good stories about people doing stuff at lockdown. I've never heard someone building their own desk, though. So that is a first, and credit to that man. So I think that's really important what you're saying there is when you're managing across the European offices, I think what came through is you're giving each individual country manager the freedom and the breathing space to be able to manage it locally properly, and then also supporting each other as different countries across Europe, and doing things Europe wide to ensure that the support structures are in place and communication is really strong. You mentioned there, obviously, as a WPP agency, about forecasts, about deadlines. What has been the impact of coronavirus on AxiCom Europe? I imagine it has taken a hit, and how have you been able to try and mitigate that as much as possible?
It absolutely has taken a hit, and I think we are extraordinarily fortunate that we've not taken a hit that we've seen from some of our peers in the industry, and I thank our lucky stars that that's been the case, because it could easily have impacted us a lot more and a lot harder. And what the future holds, who knows, really. I think, how have we mitigated against it? It was a real case of, okay, how do we really partner with our clients right now? Because, a lot of people, particularly CMOs and CFOs, looking at how can they rein in money at this point. But in a crisis like that, corporate comms, PR is so important to get it right. And actually, we found ourselves really partnering with clients to navigate them through what's the tone of voice they should be using right now? How should they be speaking to their customers? And it's really interesting because you come at this, none of us are an expert in how to deal with a global pandemic. So let's not anyone pretend that they are. But there is a degree of common sense that's going to come with it, and you can learn from your own experiences. And I certainly felt extraordinarily fatigued by all the messages from every brand I had ever once engaged with, telling me that this is a tough time, that they are here for me, that they've got this for me. And I just thought, shut up, you sell shoes, you're not here for me. You want me to buy shoes when you can sell shoes again. Zip it. And it began to really wind me up, because I thought, hold on, you're not here for me. You're worried about yourself in the same way that I'm worried about myself, in the same way that we're all worried about ourselves, and you don't know what else to say. And that's okay. It's okay to not know what to say in a situation none of us have ever lived through before. And I think that was an interesting role to play in advising clients on how to handle and navigate that, and what's going to be right for their audience, and what's the message that people are going to want to hear. And I don't know about you, Rob, but I honestly didn't have time to do half of the training courses or better myself or learn a new skill or any of the other crap that people were spoon feeding me, because I was very busy, trapped in a house with a family, with a whole business dumped on my shoulders, and nobody had time for that. And, I watched a lot of the posts from Jamila Jamil, just about how to forget coming out of this a better person, and how it's just basically okay to comfort eat, get through it, do what you've got to do. And actually, do you know what? That was kind of the message that we put out to our people. Do what you've got to do to get through this.
Yeah, I think that's really, really interesting. We're going to take a very quick break now, but after the break, we're going to talk to Kate about the transition now out of lockdown and into this new reality, how we're going to forge the way into the coming months and indeed years ahead. So don't go anywhere, we'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to PR in Lockdown. I'm with Kate Stevens, President of Europe at AxiCom. And Kate, we've been talking about the amazing journey you've had over the past year, or the last few months at least, becoming President of AxiCom Europe and taking on the responsibility of handling the COVID pandemic across the European business and all the offices. Let's talk about what you're doing now in terms of coming out of lockdown. And I say coming out of lockdown because obviously we're looking Europe-wide, so every country is in a slightly different place, so caveat what I've just said. But how are you dealing with the coming 2-3 months? How are you dealing particularly with the challenge of multiple different countries having multiple different, being in multiple different stages of containing the pandemic?
Interesting question. And one of the questions that we were asked when lockdown happened was, how on earth are you managing this immediate switch to remote working? And interestingly, we found no real significant challenges in doing that. And I've been trying to work out why. We rolled out our refreshed flexible working policy at the start of the year, somewhat fortuitously, essentially called intelligent working. And it basically is true flexible working. As long as your team know where you are and you're not missing any important things or deadlines, you can work when you need to, from where you need to. Just let people know so that we know not to worry about you. And actually, it served us really well, and we're holding on to that very closely. So as some of the offices start to reopen, we've got people, and we have had people throughout lockdown who have still needed to go into the office for whatever reason. They've not coped very well in their own environment. They've not been in a suitable environment. So actually, we have maintained a very, very skeleton few staff going into offices where they've needed to. But as we open them back up, it's very much a voluntary basis. And this is also a WPP-wide policy that return is entirely voluntary, up to a 20% capacity at first, across all of our offices, across all of Europe. And what we are seeing is a lot of people are very keen to go in. The only challenge and concern that they seem to have is over commuting, of course. So that's a hurdle for us to get over, whether they feel safe cycling, if there's another route for them to get into work, if they do want to get into work. But of course, absolutely remaining no pressure to come in until they really feel that they are ready to.
How about you personally? Are you going to be back in the office, or have you been back in the office, or do you see it being no problem, being able to manage what's going on in Europe and talking to your team leaders across Europe completely virtually as well? Across Europe it's actually easier because I wouldn't be with them anyway. Anyway, yeah, of course.
So having this ease of virtual environment just makes that faster and quicker anyway. It's going to be a long time before I get to go and visit those guys with the ever-evolving quarantine situation if you do fly anywhere. I have been into the office and I loved it. It was just so nice to have a change of scenery and to be in a different place. But of course, I've got young children, so it's very difficult to just leave them. And certainly it would be very remiss of me to expect staff to come in, especially if they do have carers' responsibilities and no other options available to them. And I think that's been one of the big challenges of this, and will remain a challenge because COVID's not going to go away anytime soon. So we'll always need to be mindful of people's individual circumstances and needs and requirements around that.
Yeah. In terms of the no significant challenges and this true flexible working environment that you've been able to roll out prior to the pandemic really hitting, and the benefits of that, enormous benefits of being one step ahead almost in having to set up this kind of infrastructure. As the manager, as the leader of all of Europe, do you have any concerns, or do you harbour any kind of concerns or doubts maybe about the impact of or of a truly virtual workforce in terms of team culture, in terms of that kind of communication that you can only get from being in person, and, you know, the hearing the conversation or the tap on the shoulder kind of thing. Do you have any kind of any thoughts around that?
Yeah, yes, I do. In short, I think people choose to work in an agency because they really enjoy that thriving environment. And when we rolled out the intelligent working principles, what we found was most people still chose to be in the office most of the time. They liked it. It's a nice environment. And as you say, there's all the touch points that you forget. There's the junior staff mentoring by just simply being surrounded by people doing business, hearing other people on the phone, hearing how people interact. And I worry a little about a lost generation who have missed out on a lot during this time. People who are early in their careers having this huge chunk of having to manage remotely and not having that same on-the-spot mentoring that just happens in an office environment. So I do think that is an impact. And what I think reality-wise will change is people are going to want to go back into the office if they are the type of person who is chosen and wants to work in that agency environment. They will probably also choose to work from home more frequently than perhaps they used to in the past. But I think they will still want that social aspect of that office environment. And I think there's huge, huge value to it. I know even me, I've enormously missed it, just turning to somebody next to me and saying, I'm stuck on this thing, and just talking it through. Sometimes just talking stuff through helps. Walking past people, hearing what they're pitching about and going, oh, that's given me an idea for this thing over here. And without that interaction, there is an awful lot missing, and that cannot be counted for in this virtual environment. And I think there's a lot that can't be counted for. The downtime of a commute, you know, that is a reset moment that none of us have had. Most of us live with other people, and we've been forced to go straight from our work situations straight into a personal situation, and you haven't had that breathing space in between, and that can mean some bristles that perhaps otherwise wouldn't be there. You know, you've come off a meeting and you're feeling a bit cheesed off about something, and the next thing you know, your partner's yapping at you because you didn't buy any cheese when you went to the shop because you said you were going to go to the shop. This isn't a real life example, by the way. It's all made up.
That's a fascinating insight into Kate Stevens there.
We row a lot about cheese in this house.
I think what's really interesting chatting to you is I'd love to get a sense of, you look at things from a pan-European perspective, managing the European operations for AxiCom. So when you're looking at the current situation and trying to move into this transition of developing a new normal, which is sustainable and works for the company and the business, if you look at the coming 2, 3, 4 months, what is the biggest risk that you see? What are you most concerned about happening? And I suppose that's looking in a kind of European-wide perspective, that management perspective. Is there anything that really jumps out of you as that could be a real problem, or that's something that we really need to focus on in terms of having something in place for?
I think it goes back to the point that COVID's not going away anytime soon. And we constantly run the risk of having another lockdown situation or something along those lines. It's a real risk for our people who are, you know, starting to really enjoy the little bit of more freedom that they have now everywhere. Most of our officers haven't actually chosen to go back in yet at all. For example, in Italy, because the rules mean that they'd have to wear their masks at their desk, and they don't really want to do that. And there's not a huge number of them, so actually they're working quite well in this environment. But I think it goes to the point of, I don't want us to remain entirely virtual, because there's such benefit of having that time together, and to lose that social side of things would be a huge miss. This virtual world doesn't really make up for true human contact. You miss some of the small cues in meetings, you miss those daily interactions. It's really hard to check in on people in a virtual environment. It's way more draining to do everything remotely all the time. Zoom fatigue is real. I mean, certainly at the start, my whole family was feeling it with the whole family wanting to jump on a Zoom call at the weekend, but you're on back-to-back Zoom calls during the day. I used to do them with my children on my knee because they were fed up of me saying, not now, just a minute, just on another call.
That is so true, actually, that the Zoom fatigue isn't just a fatigue about being on calls for work on Zoom. It's actually the fact that the medium by which you're communicating in both your personal and private life is on the same thing. So yes. Everything's just blurring into one kind of single communication thread. I think that's a really good point. I never really thought about why Zoom fatigue actually exists, but I think a large component is that you're talking to your friends in the evening, having been on Zoom all day talking work.
It's endless. It was just this endless long stream, and that for me is a real risk, that people start to become. It changes people, and I've watched it change my children, and they are very young, and I have watched it make them very anxious about going out. And I think over time, we get changed by situations. And even I have felt anxious about going out, and I am very risk averse. So if I'm impacted in that way, I'm certain plenty of others do. And I think our biggest risk is the anxiety that this remoteness is giving people. Even taking my children to the summer holiday camps, which have now opened, which they came back from the first one just so full of life. That interaction just changed everything. But they were so worried about going to this new thing, interacting with people. It became something that made them very nervous, even though they just had the best time. And that's almost how I felt going into the office for the first time. I felt anxious. What's it going to be like? What am I going to have to do as I walk in? What's the new setup going to look like? Am I going to get questioned on this? How do I even open the toilet door? Am I allowed to touch it? Like, how does this work? And going there, seeing the few colleagues that were in, talking to them, I felt alive coming out. And, the longer we remain in this remote and isolated working environment, the more that I think that's going to be a risk to us. It's a new skill set to manage a virtual and remote workforce. It's not one that we're all born naturally to do. It takes a certain different type of skill. And, obviously in the work that we do, tech, we've communicated a lot on that for clients in the past. I mean, every tech brand and their dog has done a future of the workplace type look at how more remote working is going to make businesses thrive, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And now it's putting it through its paces. If we were in this situation 5, 8, 10 years ago, we would have been hit way harder because the tech just wasn't quite as good as it is now. But when we talk about that future of the workplace, we also talk from an HR perspective about the upskilling of your people, the different skill set it requires to manage a workforce remotely. And it is different, and it's not the same. You can't just pluck those same interpersonal skills and expect them to work remotely, because there's a whole load more touch points that you need to have with people to make sure that they know you're thinking about them, and to make sure that you're clear on what's being delivered by them without feeling like they're being micromanaged. And that's the other danger. People constantly checking in on somebody because they can't see them. So they think, maybe they're not doing any work. And it's a mindset change. It's a huge change for everybody.
I think that's really, really interesting insight into how we're going to change going forwards, but also in terms of management and skill set and teams, how this new reality is going to change us, and how we need to be aware of how it's going to change us as well. Let's just talk very, very quickly about the business front of AxiCom Europe. Obviously, you've said that the coronavirus has caused a significant amount of disruption to you. What's your priorities in terms of the services you're providing your clients, in terms of the business side for the next 3-4 months, and maybe going up to 6 months? What's your view? What's your priorities?
Initially, it was really about partnering with clients and making ourselves indispensable to them. We're seeing now those clients that went on pause starting up again. So making sure that we deliver against what we have to deliver for those guys. But also, it's about helping them navigate. I hear a lot of CEOs talking about a post-COVID world. And I think the simple reality is there's no post-COVID world. It's not going to magically go away ever. So we have to live and work in this environment. So I think there's also a huge onus on us as a business to change the way we think about things. Our clients still need to launch things. They still need to interact with their customers. They still need to have those touch points. So how can we change our approach in terms of delivering those meaningful moments, either virtually or in a touchless environment? If you have a client that's launching something that requires a hands-on typically, well, that's not going to be happening anytime soon because the logistics of the sanitizing is going to just be hugely challenging. But also, that's going to remain the way for a long time. We're seeing all of our key trade shows turning into virtual moments. And actually, is this an opportunity for clients to reframe their launch moments and the moments that matter to them? How can we think creatively about creating newsrooms or touch points with media that, to the point that I made about Zoom fatigue, isn't just going to exhaust all of those people who are being asked to join endless back-to-back virtual moments? What is it that we can do differently? And also, how can we use technology to help us with that? There's some interesting thoughts around the fact that we have been in this lockdown environment and we've been really enjoying streaming content on Netflix or other different platforms, and actually how we're craving more of that, but more interesting, more interactive stuff like that, because COVID's not going away. We're still going to be needing these different touch points. So, are we going to see more and more happen in terms of augmented reality and things like that, just to give us something a bit different? So I think there's a huge opportunity for us as comms professionals to think about all of those things, behaviors of consumers, through to helping our clients navigate a new path as they work through their comms plans. And that actually is an exciting challenge for us all, because nobody wants to be bored, right? We're in this game because we like the fact that it changes quickly, and we've got to keep up with it.
Kate, if people wanted to get in touch with you on social media, but also get in touch with AxiCom, what's the best way for them to do that?
They can email us through the website. They can tweet us. They can find us on Instagram. We're easily contactable. I think my contact details are on the website. There's also a generic HRE one. There's also an info, which comes actually to me still also.
Thanks so much for coming on the podcast, Kate. It was really, really fantastically insightful talking to you and what you've been up to. And congratulations on becoming President of Europe as well. I don't think actually I even said that at the beginning.
Okay, you can call me El Presidente.
Thanks so much for listening to the PR in Lockdown podcast. Don't forget, this is an ongoing series. So if you like what you've listened to, you can subscribe to us on your preferred podcast platform. Or if you prefer watching podcasts, we are on YouTube at just searching PR in Lockdown. You'll see Kate and I's smiling faces back at you. But thanks a lot for listening. We'll see you on the next episode. PR in Lockdown is presented by Rob Double. And the guest this episode was Kate Stevens, President of Europe at AxiCom. It is created by Access Studios in collaboration with the PRCA.